The attack in London, Ontario, that killed 4 members of one Muslim family has left a community devastated and many more people beyond there reeling. But it also raises very hard questions about how such a thing can happen in the first place and what environment allows that kind of hate to fester. With us now to talk through some of that in the nation's capital, Sheema Khan, who wrote the book of Hockey and Hijab, Reflections of a Canadian Muslim Woman, and a monthly columnist for the Global Mail. In Prince Edward County, Barbara Perry, professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities and director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. And in London, Ontario, Selma Tobah, PhD candidate in Health and Rehab at Western University. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for being here for a difficult conversation. And just to get us into the conversation, I wanted to read a little bit of a post that went viral. So back in 2014, former Progressive Conservative candidate Jeff Bennett encountered racist and anti-Muslim comments on the campaign trail in Ontario. Back then, he didn't say anything, and he's now grappling with that fact 7 years later after this unthinkable act of violence in London, Ontario. In a Facebook post, he wrote, "Boy, are we happy to see you at our door this election. I can tell by looking at you that Jeff Bennett is a candidate I can support." These are things people said to me when I was knocking on doors in London West as the PC party candidate in 2014. It happened many times. I would usually just thank them for their support and carry on. But it bothered me immensely. These people who had never met me saw nothing special in me. They were happy only that my name was English and my skin was white. Now I see people expressing shock that a racist terrorist would drive his truck into the pathway of a Muslim family going for a walk. London is better than this, they say. I can't believe this happened here. Bullshit. I knocked on thousands of doors in the very neighborhood this atrocity occurred. This terrorist may have been alone in that truck on that day, but he was not acting alone. He was raised in a racist city that pretends it isn't. This is just an excerpt from a longer post, and we recommend people read the entire post that has been widely circulated online. Selma, I wanted to start with you, considering that you are in London, Ontario. I can only imagine what the mood is like there. What was your reaction when you saw this statement?
I would say I wasn't surprised. I think he really hits the nail on the head on the way racism manifests itself in the city, and I would argue in the country at large. Not every Canadian, I hope not many Canadians, can see themselves mauling a family on an evening walk. But many do make comments like the ones Jeff Bennett is talking about, who is a real Canadian or who it is that they trust to make decisions in places of leadership and in positions of power. And that is how racism manifests itself on a daily basis.
Does it matter that he said it now as opposed to back then?
To me, it does. I really struggled when I read this. I'm happy that he is exposing this kind of racism and is really coming to terms with it and is calling it out and is apologetic that he didn't say anything in the moment. But it's been 7 years, and people are being killed. I'm really tired waiting for people to have this reckoning with themselves. And with the nation. And I think it's a conversation that we need to have. So, as appreciative as I am that, he is made this post, I'm also really frustrated that it took this long.
Sheema, what were your thoughts when you saw that statement?
Well, I was appreciative of the fact that he did make those statements. It's not easy to do something like that. It does take courage, and it takes a great deal of honesty. And it's never too late to do that. I think he's also sparked a wider conversation amongst the people of London, and I think people across this land, to look in the mirror and to see what they've done. It's vital what he's done. So I'm very appreciative of that.
And Barbara, what were your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I also appreciate what he said, because it really highlights what I often refer to as kind of hate. The individuals do not act individually, but there needs to be an environment that shapes that hostility, that says that this is a legitimate target. So I think that he, maybe too little, too late, but he has acknowledged, I think, the fact that it is a systemic issue. Hatred, this sort of violence is a systemic issue. It's not just an individual issue.
I just wanted to go back to one of the sentences that he wrote. He says this perpetrator was raised in a racist city that pretends it isn't. Barbara, in your view, is London a racist city, as Jeff Bennett says?
Well, I think I've seen in terms of public opinion polling, but also in terms of the presence of the far right, that there's something about Western Ontario in particular, sort of quite broadly, that seems to house or host these sorts of attitudes. And I think London is one of those cities. I mean, Hamilton is another, Tri-Cities to some extent as well. And it's sort of a reactionary ethos amongst, one hopes, relatively small proportion of the population. I mean, these are areas that have been homogeneously white, homogeneously Christian, and in the last 10 or 15 years have seen really fast demographic change that isn't welcomed by everyone. And so the hatred that we're seeing is a reaction to change, and that's certainly what we're seeing in that context. But I think it's also part of a broader pattern. It's not just London, it's not just Western Ontario, but it is a national problem that we're grappling with right now. I will say that has been one of the hot spots for far right activity, not just in this current uptick in activity, but even in the 90s and early 2000s, which was sort of the last heyday for the far right. So it really is a breeding ground of some sort that foments that kind of hostility that can give rise to these extreme forms of violence.
And Selma, just to build on what Barbara just said, at the vigil, there were thousands of people from different backgrounds, different faiths, and they all gathered to mourn the killings of this family. You live in London. In your view, is London a racist city, as Jeff Bennett says?
Absolutely. I think that this has been, well documented. There are tons of people who have written articles, op-eds, books about their treatment in London. I don't know a single racialized person, not just a Muslim person, but I don't know a single racialized person that hasn't had a racist incident in the city with varying degrees of frequency and concern. I think it's easy also to look at London and to ask the questions about why it is Southwest Ontario in particular houses these types of attitudes. But I think it would be a mistake not to tie the violence that we are seeing in this region to the violence that we see across the country. We can't then, ignore the fact that we have had, 10 Muslim women, mostly Black, in Alberta who have been attacked since December of 2020. We can't, ignore the systemic racism that Muslim women face in Quebec amongst other people of faith. This is a problem across the nation, and I think it would be really easy to look at specifically this region, but I think we also have to tie it to the sentiments that we're seeing across the country.
I grew up after the post that Jeff Bennett posted. There was another politician in London who pushed back and said, London is not a racist city. We take care of our communities. I grew up in London. The reason I'm in London is because of a white woman in London, Ontario, sponsored my family from a refugee camp in Kenya. She had never been to that part of the world. This was before Facebook, Twitter. She had never seen a picture of us. And when she brought us to Canada, she treated us, we were her family. At the same time, growing up in London, it was really challenging because it was a very homogeneous environment. And my family experienced racism. We can't forget Philip Rushton. So just to, as a follow-up, Selma, we do have this perception that Canada is this, our brand is that we're friendly, welcoming, and in this moment, especially with what's been going on in London, people want to push back and say, well, it's not our community. We're not like that. What would you like for people, or how do we move forward if there's already that pushback that this isn't happening even after this tragedy has happened in on our land, on this land
I don't
anyway,
think,
not our land.
yes, no, I don't think anyone is denying or discounting, acts of generosity and welcome and love, like you said, at the vigil. I think that was, that outpour of support was touching for so many, including myself. But I think that by looking away and by refusing to really be introspective about the violence that so many people of color have been saying for decades, have been facing, then I think that we risk losing the focus here. And so, yes, I think it's necessary, especially for young Canadians, to not lose hope, to look at those optimistic examples. But I think it is very necessary to keep the spotlight on not just Islamophobia, but white supremacist violence across the country and the way it manifests itself in violence, systemically, interpersonally, against people of color across Canada.
And Sheema, people of color have been talking about this discrimination. In the past year, we've seen a reckoning where we're having conversations I don't think we would have been able to have maybe 3 years ago. In this situation, is it significant that it's a white Londoner that is making this statement?
You're talking about the statement by
Jeff Bennett,
yes.
naming it.
It's very significant. I mean, I can't think of another time following, another tragedy where someone, someone has become has been so forthright. It's very important, and I think you pointed out demographics are changing, and you see this not just in Canada, but you see this in the U.S. and in European countries. As demographics change, there is pushback, there is discomfort, and we have to come together as a country and not just ask ourselves what kind of country we want going forward, but how hard are we going to work to get to where we want to be. And that does involve uncomfortable conversations. Some will not participate. I think for those, leave them aside. I think we have to work together and reach out with those who do understand and who do want to get the work done. And then slowly others will come along, but I would not lose hope. We are going through changes, and unfortunately what we've seen is pushback against some of these changes.
And as Selma pointed out, this is something that's been happening across the country. There's been multiple incidences. At the vigil, a speaker spoke of a young relative worrying about appearing to be too Muslim. Sheema, is this something that you've grappled with, worried that you were, who you are will put you in danger?
I not after this incident. I think I felt that way after 9/11, which was almost 20 years ago. But I've been through many so-called battles. It goes back decades. I was in Quebec, at the time of the second referendum, and you can see it building, and at some point you say, well, I'm not going to change who I am, and given to the fear or to the hatred of others, I am who I am, and I'm going to continue to live as I am, if you want, defiant, but I'm not going to change my ways because someone doesn't want me to be who I am. I think that would be capitulation, and we should stand firm about being who we are and standing with dignity and courage.
And Selma, I want to ask you the same question too, because I know that it always feels like when something happens to, if someone else hasn't experienced that thing, it feels as if you have to write a dissertation of what you've experienced and explain and kind of live through the trauma, and try to prove to other people what your experiences have been like. I want to ask you that same question, and I don't mean to ask it as a way to make you relive that trauma or not to believe you, but I think a lot of people don't have, when they leave their home, they might not leave their home with the same concerns as so many other people do.
Yeah. My dad has said to myself and my siblings for years Don't jaywalk, because it may give someone who hates Muslims an excuse to run you over and call it a traffic accident. So this is something that, you know, we've been worried about for years, for our safety in public places. You know, and I think just the increased frequency and violence, I would say, and just the horror of the attacks that we're seeing just brings those fears to life. And that they're no longer what ifs, but when for so many of us.
And Barbara, you know, when we talk about what happened this past week, I've been rethinking the term Islamophobia. I saw someone tweet about it and say that when you say Islamophobia, it's kind of like arachnophobia, when, you know, the phobia, you're afraid of something. And they said that they would rather we use the terminology anti-Muslim hate. Does the language matter in this situation? Do we need to think about it, how we term certain things?
That's a really great question, because if we think about what phobia means, it's an irrational fear, right? You referenced arachnophobia. That's irrational. You know, most spiders are not toxic and aren't going to kill us. And so I think that in this context, to talk about Islamophobia, given what I described earlier in terms of that climate of hate, Islamophobia is not irrational, right? It's something that we are socialized to experience. You know, given the political narratives, given the narratives of the far right, and even of some academics, you know, it makes sense that there is fear, there's hostility towards Muslim because of the mythologies and the stereotypes that have been associated with them and attached to them. So, you know, I think you're absolutely right. You know, to talk about anti-Muslim hatred is, you know, we call it what it is. But I think, you know, we've been using the phobia for so long, it's hard to back away from that. But I think people need to understand the real roots of the term.
You know, what do we know about this perpetrator?
We don't know a great deal. We're just hearing some coming out of divorce records from his parents' divorce a few years back, where he's angry, confrontational. There was some mention that perhaps there was a swastika on his T-shirt. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was affiliated with any formal hate group. I think the fact that law enforcement designated this as hate motivated so quickly suggests that there was some documentary about, you know, his Islamophobic or anti-Muslim sentiments. So what else do we know? I think we're learning that he was raised in a fairly conservative Christian household, and that the family supported things like, you know, right to life organizations, which suggests some, you know, very conservative values, which might include, you know, sort of exclusionary views of racialized communities of Muslims. Again, it's very early, and very little is coming out about him, but there's no real pattern. There's no one profile associated with the men primarily who have engaged in these acts of xenophobic violence across the globe, aside from the fact that they're typically young white males.
You mentioned his Christian background. I mean, I was raised in a Christian environment, and it's kind of shocking. We already touched a little bit. Selma was talking about this is not just a London problem to confront. You know, I'm trying to figure out the wording, because some people might say, you know, this is a huge leap from someone just, you know, being racist, because racist is really harmful and damaging. But how does someone get from, you know, being racist to committing this extremist attack where so many people were killed?
Yeah, well, it's not a linear progression. We know from, you know, public opinion polls and from hate crime data even, we know on the far right that there are, in the Canadian context, you know, tens of thousands perhaps who are anti-Muslim, but very few in this way. So I think that, you know, we're going to have at how he was animated, how he was mobilized. Was there engagement with far right online? And then, you have to add in what is the personal benefit, if you will, for him of engaging in this sort of behavior. The fact that he was so calmly arrested and apparently, told the taxi driver to call the police and to film the arrest suggests that he was looking for his moment of glory. So did he want to be a martyr? Does he want to be, a hero for the cause, like Manassian was for the incel movement? That seems to be, one of the pieces here. So it's not just a Muslim sentiment; it's that desire to leave his mark, to somehow make a name for himself, even if in this, dark ways.
We have about less than 10 minutes left, but I wanted to get reaction from Selma and Sheema. Selma?
Yeah, I think, we have a lot of conversations, again, about London and about the sentiment towards Muslims in London and across the country. But I think it's also necessary to have a conversation about white supremacy and the way it manifests itself interpersonally and in the structures of our country. I know we're going to have a reckoning about the Bill 21 in Quebec. We have to, there was just a report that came out where it said that the CRA between 2008 and 2015, 75% of the organizations that lost their charitable status were Muslim organizations. We have to have a conversation about the way CSIS treats Muslim individuals and communities. The outgoing commander of the armed forces recently said, we have a Proud Boys problem in our armed forces. We have to have a conversation about the way white supremacy presents itself and uses the structures within our country to target and to harm people of color. So yes, it is an interpersonal issue, and yes, it is a single individual in this case that committed this act of violence. But we have to ask, what is it about the structures and the systems within our nation that makes him think that it's okay to do this?
Selma, I wanted to follow up with that. At the London Vigil, politicians of all stripes spoke of being heartbroken and outraged. Premier Doug Ford said, I want every single Muslim person, every Muslim family to know that we're with them. We'll always have your backs. Yet a few days ago, his government blocked a motion condemning Islamophobia that was, again, that word, and that was brought forward by Liberal Mitzi Hunter. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was also at the vigil, and he said Islamophobia is real, racism is real. And when he was asked to denounce Bill 21 that you mentioned, provincial legislation in place in Quebec that bars the wearing of religious symbols and that is said to disproportionately target Muslim women who wear the hijab or niqab, he maintains that it's up to the people of Quebec to challenge that legislation in court. If not now, after this unspeakable tragedy, what do you think it will take for those in power to go beyond words, which so many of them at the London Vigil said we needed to move beyond words and to go into action?
That's a really scary question. What will it take? And I think that's a question that not just Muslims, but many communities have been asking for years. I mean, this country is reeling constantly from the aftermath of white supremacist violence and the consistency of it. We just, are reeling from the news of 250 children, babies, being, found in an unmarked grave in residential schools. And we have the Truth and Reconciliation Committee who's been asking for funding to find more money. We have communities across this country have been asking the government for action, for actionable steps to be taken. We need to move beyond words. And, we are reeling from this violence and the aftermath of it on a regular basis. And I think so many of us are saying enough is enough. We need, you can't come to our vigils and express condolences after we've been killed and not do everything within your power to make sure that we stay alive.
And Sheema?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Of course, Aaron O'Toole, who, what was it, 4 years ago after the Quebec City massacre, when, M103 was raised and voted upon, he, along with his Conservative Party members, voted against it. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. And here's a proposition. I understand why the Conservatives and the Liberals are not voicing or not intervening against Bill 21, because let's face it, there's an election on the horizon and Quebec has a large number of votes. So there's a political calculation there. And this is what political parties do. Here's a suggestion. Can we put principle above politics and have the leaders of all the major parties come together and say in unison that we oppose Bill 21 and we are not going to let electioneering dictate or subsume basic fundamental principles of every Canadian in this country? Can we have our political leaders come together and say, forget about electioneering. We all agree that this law is wrong, and we, and come together and do what is required at a national level. That to me is true leadership. Otherwise, these are empty words. And I watched parts of the vigil, and the words from politicians didn't touch me in one bit. For me, it was same old, same old.
And Barbara, when I was talking about the London Vigil, I think all of the politicians said the same thing. We need to move beyond words into action. And my understanding is that hate crimes have been on the rise in Canada for the past few years. We have, Sheema mentioned electioneering. We have a few elections on the horizon. Can you give us a sense of the scope of the problem when it comes to hate crimes in Canada?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I share the frustration about this focus on words and language and the failure to act, especially in this context. So one of the things that we've heard from politicians is, this is not our Canada. This is not our land. And clearly it is, because this is, an extensive problem, not just for Muslim communities, but other communities as well. So, for example, in 2016, from 2016 to 2017, we saw a 47% increase in hate crime reported to police. If we'd seen that kind of jump in any other category of crime, we'd have been asking for a national inquiry. We would have been so concerned, and there was silence. This is an extensive problem. It's not one that has been, forcefully reckoned with. I think the other piece is, you referred to, action over words. We do have this lovely national action plan against racism, and I think it's time to move from the plan to the action in all of these areas.
Can you give us a sense of which groups are targeted and also why this is happening? Why is there an increase in hate crimes?
Sure. Well, typically year to year, anti-Black hate crime has been most frequent, then anti-Semitic, then anti-Muslim, followed by anti-gay violence, particularly violence against gay men. So those are the most heavily targeted communities. And I think there are a whole array of factors that play into that. It's a historical legacy. We've never been, without hostility, hatred, distrust of other communities. But in contemporary terms, that includes the political rhetoric that's been circulating, vilifying Muslims, not just in the US with Trump, but in the Canadian context as well. Think about the hotline for barbaric cultural practices, screening for Canadian values. All of those are really thinly coded, thinly veiled sentiments that are meant to and to vilify Muslim communities in particular. So that has played into it. I think that construction of the refugee crisis, as it was referred to, that really a couple of years ago, that sort of was collapsed with anti-Muslim sentiment, because it was Muslim refugees that were of concern. You add to that the economic anxieties in Western Canada in particular that were already emerging around the energy sector, and now we have COVID, which has exacerbated anxiety, fear in general. Asian communities are being affected, Jewish communities are being affected, but also Muslim communities.
I just wanted to give Selma and Sheema 30 seconds each to what you both would like to see happen in the next little while. Sheema, I'll have you go first, please.
I'd like to see leadership, political leadership, for one. It's time for some kind of principled action. Barring that, I think now it's up to civil society. The politicians won't perform their duties. I think it's up to each and every one of us to demand better. of ourselves, of our communities, of our neighborhoods, to work at at the grassroots and keep pushing. We can't just let this fester. It's going to get worse. Like I said, if you can't find, if the politicians don't lead, then it's up to us to lead as ordinary citizens and do what we can.
And Selma?
The National Council of Canadian Muslims, NCCM, has put the call out for a national summit on Islamophobia and calling political leaders of all levels to join the conversation and to address the nature of Islamophobia interpersonally, structurally, in all levels and across this country. And I think that's it's time for that to happen. I think it's time for us to have a national reckoning and a conversation about the nature of white supremacy in Canada. And like Sheema said, if we don't see action, then things are just going to get worse, and we're going to see a continued escalation of this violence.
And that's all the time we have tonight. I'm really grateful for your insights, and our thoughts and prayers go to the Muslim community in London. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.